right. So yeah, as we just discussed, we've been working on the designer. Mohammed, you mentioned Azure Data Fabric as a tool to look to for the designer for Elsa 3. So I thought maybe this week we can look at some of the updates I've made on the designer specifically for activity embedding. Hi, Christina.
Hey,
How's it going?
yeah, it's going good. I was looking a bit on send HTTP request activity.
Oh, nice. That's the Elsa 3
Mm-hmm.
activity, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, the UI looks nice. Did you change something?
Oh, we changed many things. I will actually,
Oh, okay.
you will see as I go through the update in a second that you
Mm-hmm.
were referring to
Is that done?
this one, HTTP
Yeah,
request
that's
activity.
done.
Very cool.
And how are you guys doing?
Yeah, doing pretty well. Having a lot of fun with the Elsa 3 designer, of course. Last week we discussed some of the changes. We specifically talked about transforming a flowchart style workflow into a nested hierarchy structure. And then Mohammed came with the tip of Azure Data Fabric, which I would like to show in a couple of minutes. And maybe we can talk about that. So as you
Mm-hmm.
can tell already, my mind's been full with the Elsa 3 designer. And it's been a
Okay, cool.
productive week.
Yeah, that's super nice. It looked nice.
Yeah. So, does any one of you have any specific topics you would like to discuss during today's meeting?
Not from my side, no.
No, I have no specific things to talk about.
All right, cool. Yeah, then let's go over the Elsa 3 updates. So you haven't seen this yet, Christina. Did you see the new update, Frans? This is just a splash screen, and it might be temporary. It's just something nice to look at while we work on the features.
Yeah, I saw it briefly the previous time. I think it was already there, right?
Yeah, it's been there for a couple of weeks. Yeah, but this is not the interesting part. The interesting part, yeah, let me walk you through the designer changes step by step. And so we will start with a new canvas. And as you recall, last week we talked about activities that can contain other activities, like the if activity, right? So before this change, the way it would work, you would see an if activity with two outcomes, and then you can connect to the next activity, use it by connecting these lines. So it would look like this. Of course, the if activity has changed significantly. And we'll also talk about ways where you can still have the separate lines. So where you have a decision activity or an if activity with two lines. In fact, let me open Windows Workflow Foundation activities. So what I wanted to explain is that before this designer change, what you would see is an if activity with two outcomes, a then and an else, and then you can connect whatever else you want to execute, right? But a different change with Elsa 3 is that if you look at the if else activity, or I should say the if activity as it's named, it has a then property and an else property. It can contain a single activity and not a sequence of activity or an array of activities. So if you wanted to execute multiple steps, you need a container type activity, which is a different structure than having a set of connections between activities, right? So that's why I was working on a way to transpose or transform a network of activities into a container activity, which itself would be a nested flowchart. A little bit complicated. It worked. I actually have another branch where it does work. But yeah, based on some further discussions I had with Mohammed, I realized maybe we should just update the designers and yeah, visually create the workflows as it's also stored structurally. So with that, we have a new looking type of activity where activities that have properties of type by activity, they will show those properties visually here. And what this allows you to do is to actually drill into these ports, as I call them for now, which is a little bit confusing, frankly, because these little circles are also called ports, but they represent a different kind of connection between activities. So I need to sort that out before release, but for now it's also called a port. And what you can do, you can actually drill into it and then design a nested workflow, if you will. And then on the top you will see the path. And this is based on what we have in Azure Data Fabric, I believe it's called. I wasn't aware of this tool. It was actually a very, very nice tip from Mohammed to look into this, because it seems to me it's heavily inspired on Windows Workflow Foundation, but simplified. So let me open the Studio. Maybe you'll recognize it if you've used anything similar to Workflow Foundation. All right, so let me create a new pipeline, collapse this tool panel. So here we have an empty canvas, and let me just start with one of these. So let's say we have a if condition. So as you can see, this is an activity and it has a true and a false property, and then you can go in and actually create the workflow for the true activities. So what this means that if the condition evaluates to true, then whatever workflow you create here will be executed. And then you can go back and do the same for false. So it's, as you can see, it's heavily inspired on that. So what I would like to do now is give an actual demo that with a workflow that actually works. So let's go back to the root view or the root of the hierarchy. And then here we'll write something to the console called start. And I'm gonna remove this one and replace with a for each so we can see what it takes to loop over a set of items and then print them to the console. So here we will configure this one with little array. And to access each current item as it iterates, you need to capture the output. So the current value will be stored in whatever output target we specify here. Right now there's only one such type, which is workflow variables, but we might have future possibilities to capture the output or maybe even directly connect it to another activity or have another activity receive the output as it executes. I don't know yet, but this is for now it's just variable. So let's create a variable called current item of type string. Let's connect these two. And then in the for each body, we can specify what the logic is supposed to be for each iteration. So the most simple thing, of course, to do is just write the current item. Could be like this. So it's the current item. So this is the variable I declared on the workflow. So that's this guy. And of course, because this is JavaScript, we can use string interpolation. So we could say something like this, just to make it a little bit more interesting. Of course, you could do other things. Right now it's a single activity, but you could also do things like set a delay. So it waits for, let's say, a second for each iteration. All right. So as Mohammed also discovered, there's a bug, and here you see it on display. There's supposed to be a navigator, but there's a little bug that doesn't update it correctly when you add new levels or new activities. So I'm just going to publish this for now and refresh. So now we see the current path, and you can go multiple levels deep. So for example, I could add an if statement here, and let's say we want to reconnect this to the if, and let's say that if the current item is item 2, then I don't know, maybe we request that the user grants permission to continue, as a silly example. But let's see what that looks like. So I would say if current item equals item 2. So if this evaluates to true, then we want to do something in the then outcome. So here we would instruct the user basically by saying please approve. And we'll use, just because we don't have too many activities as of yet, but we can just say, let's request that the user approves by sending some HTTP request to some endpoint. So we can say approve, for example. And when it's approved, we say thanks, whatever, right? So again, this is not updating. I'm gonna refresh just so that you get a picture for what it's gonna look like visually. So this is a way to navigate back to the upper layers of the workflow. So here we're in the deepest layer. We can go back one level up. Here we see the body of the for each. So if current item equals item 2, we execute this nested activity. And by the way, right now you see flowchart because the type of activity is actually a flowchart. This thing is a flowchart. The canvas basically represents the flowchart. It's an activity. And granted, this is not very descriptive. This doesn't mean anything to a user that looks at this. So we need a way to allow the user to provide some description or display name. Also, as a future update, what I would like for the user to be able to do is, instead of always defaulting to creating a workflow, when you hit the edit pencil icon, you should be able to add an arbitrary activity. Because as you recall, the then property is of type iActivity. If there's just one activity that you want to execute, maybe it's a simple write line or an HTTP request, or even a custom activity that you want to invoke, you should be able to just add or assign that activity to this property. But this requires some more enhancements to the designer so that you can actually maybe drag and drop something into it, or where you can click on the plus icon and it shows a drop-down list with available activities like a drop-down picker, or even drag and drop something into it. But yeah, those details we need to figure out still. At the very least, structurally, that now becomes possible, but for the time being, it will be a flowchart. And I want to be able to highlight the flowchart so that you can edit its properties on the right-hand side and give it a custom name. That already should help a lot. But anyway, let's go back to the workflow at hand. So this is now done. And then here we write the current item. Here we have a delay. So let's see if what this does for now. And let's also mark the end of the workflow. All right, so let's publish this and take the definition ID, and then we can invoke this workflow from Postman. So first, let me clean the console out, or the console contents, so we can see what happens. So now I executed the workflow. We see that start was printed, bunch of current items, and then done. So this doesn't do exactly what I intended for it to do, so it could be a bug, but let's see if we can figure this out. First of all, the current item should actually display the current item, right? So let's see what's going on there. So for each activity, I forgot to assign its current value to the current item variable. So that variable remained empty, so that's one issue. Let's see what happens if we try again. So now every second per the delay we see the current item, but still it's not displaying the current text. This I actually know this is a bug which has to do with the delay activity and the fact that the variable is not being persisted by default. So by default, none of the stuff is persisted into the database. And this is to prevent issues that we have with Elsa 2, when you, for example, use objects that aren't serializable, and then you have to do all sorts of stuff to prevent it from being serialized. And in Elsa 3, it's the other way around. If you want something to persist, you need to be explicit about that. So here, let's use memory for now to store the variable. You could also store it as part of the workflow instance, which gets persisted every time the delay activity executes, or any other suspending or blocking activity. So let's try this again. All right, this looks better. And now we also see, because item 2 is about to be displayed, but we have this if activity, which included a blocking activity, which is the HTTP endpoint. So let's see if we can resume this. And I think the URL was approve. Nope, no, it's not it. Or it was this thing, but there's some bug somewhere where it currently doesn't store this correctly. So let me see if I can make it work. So I'm gonna change this to something else. Of course, I also have to restart the workflow because the workflow instance doesn't take into effect any changes I make here. So delete this guy here and try again. Nope, doesn't want to work. I need to look into this issue. Sorry about that. Of course, you'll believe me when I tell you that it worked before the demo.
Yeah, of course. No, I believe you. Quick question though. You have an HTTP endpoint. Is that just listening to any request that comes in, or is it tied to the workflow instance?
Oh, this is bound to the workflow instance because it's not used as a starting activity. So it would only work when a workflow instance is actually blocked on this activity. And to be more specific, if we look at the workflow bookmarks, we see 3 of them because I started 3 instances of it. So if I was able to successfully resume the workflow, this request made to approve 1 or approve would execute all 3 bookmarks. Well, not all 3 because one of them is listening for, or 2 of them are listening for approve 1, and this one is listening just for the approve path. So if this one succeeded, both of them would execute. Of course, in real world scenarios, probably what you want is to invoke one workflow instance or trigger one of them. And for that, you need to rely on correlation, but we did not specify any correlation ID. And when you do correlate your workflow instance with some identifier, you also need to include that identifier when you make an HTTP request, typically done through a query string parameter or an HTTP header. This is the way it works in Elsa 2, and similarly, it will work in the same way in Elsa 3.
But in Elsa 2, you had a receive signal basically, and that had the body of a workflow instance and a correlation ID and one more, as I recall.
Mm-hmm.
But is that the workflow instance ID is not longer supported, that it's only being correlation ID?
Well, it's just not implemented yet. There's no signaling yet in Elsa 3, but probably it will work in a similar way, where if you always have a workflow instance ID at your disposal to invoke a specific instance, and also correlation is supported. And these are just 2 bits of information you need, or you need one of them in order to be able to target a specific workflow instance. But the point of the engine is that you should be able to extend on it. You can, of course, also create custom tables and make custom associations. Ultimately, we have a set of low-level APIs to invoke workflows directly, including workflow instances, and then a set of higher-level services that implement more commonly used scenarios, but you're not limited to those. What we do have, which we don't have in Elsa 2, not completely anyway, is the event Yeah, I didn't add it here, but there's actually let me see if I can add it.
I think it's under primitive.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Thank you. Yeah. So this one is what I was looking for. So this is an event. And with the event, it allows your application to just publish an event, and then it would trigger a workflow, a new workflow instance, or resume an existing workflow instance. And it has just a simple thing called an event name. It could be custom event. So let's switch this out. So when this executes, it will block workflow execution until it receives an event called custom event. And let's see if this works. So first I'm gonna start a new instance. All right, so now we have an instance blocked on the event name called custom event. And to resume this workflow instance, there is an API here called trigger, where you specify the event name, so in this case custom event, and then this is just an action on this resource called trigger. So this is part of the route. Body, I think at some point will allow you to provide input, custom input that your workflow can then access. Let's see what happens if I do this. Okay, looks like it did something. All right, and then so there seems to be a bug in the HTTP endpoint, but this activity allowed me to resume the workflow instance. And as you can see, then it goes to item 2 and 3 and then ultimately done.
Awesome. One quick question about the correlation ID. I noticed that in Elsa 2 there was a constraint that it should be unique. Still the case?
So the uniqueness is not imposed at this point. And maybe, I don't know actually if it makes sense for the correlation ID to be unique per workflow instance or if it should be unique per workflow definition. So maybe you should be able to have multiple instances of a given workflow definition, and then within that set, only one of them can have the same correlation ID. It depends on your scenario. Some users want it to be unique, and others have scenarios where they want to use the same correlation ID across multiple instances of the same workflow definition, as well as others. I think it should not be restricted. I think if you want to ensure that only one instance of a given correlation ID executes at any given time of a given workflow definition, we should try and find a different way to achieve that. But at this moment, it's unrestricted, and it probably will be that way. But yeah, again, we need to come up with a mechanism to also allow those other users to actually make sure that one instance executes if it's correlated.
Okay. Yeah, I was looking into that because we are using that basically for a messaging process where there is a conversation ID basically, and I wanted to correlate all the all the processes that handled messages within that conversation just by the conversation ID, and I set then the correlation ID. But since there were multiple messages, I got tied up because correlation ID was already mentioned, and I wanted to use that just for analysis later on, so I can easily find which processes were for the same conversation. But maybe I shouldn't use the correlation ID for that, but something else.
Yeah, that's a good point, because you should be able to associate or annotate your workflow definition, but also your workflow instances with custom data, and not be limited to just using a correlation ID, but have different tags. So a little bit similar to labels for workflow definitions. So here we can say not this one, but this one. You should be able to say, and don't mind this UI bug here, we'll fix that. Let's say we have label 1 and label 2. Yeah, there's some UI work to be done here to be fixed. Label 2. Okay, let's go with this. So these could be custom values, and similar. So this is associated with the workflow definition, but similarly, you can imagine having something like this for workflow instances. So you can associate this conversation ID using a label called conversation ID, for example, and then you can also query by it, which also means you should be able to resume workflow instances by specific conversation ID if that would make sense in your use case scenario, or collect all processes or workflow instances for a single conversation ID and correlate it in that way. So that would be a nice feature to add actually.
Yeah, I think I like the concept of labels, and I would use that, for instance, to do that conversation ID. I don't see the necessity of having the ability to, based on the label, resume, because I think the workflow instance ID for that. And the correlation ID could be the one to use for that, and It provides enough functionality based on those two and not having the labels as well.
Yeah, makes sense.
It's great if we could do this. That makes it so much easier for your process analysis later on.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, it's looking really impressive. Great progress since last time.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with this. This was one of the things that I was actually waiting a little bit whether I should delve into it. It seemed very complicated to be able to, create these hierarchies. But in this way, it already works well. It's not perfect yet, but it's getting there. And most importantly, it's a very simple structure to set up compared to what I was trying before, transposing networks into embedded activities, which is prone to error. Yeah, I took a lot of inspiration from this, as I mentioned. And what I noticed that this engine does, if you look at the structures, so what they allow you to do is they allow you to add multiple activities on a given slot. So here we have the true slot. And if you edit this, you can, let's say you can have this one and this one. So these are two activities. We can, of course, connect them. And if we go back up the level, displays the number of activities. And the way they do it is as follows. Basically, any container or any slot can have multiple activities. And this is in contrast to Elsa 3, which only allows you to add one activity. And I'll explain in a minute why this is the case, but it's interesting to see what they are doing. And also the way they relate or associate one activity to the other one. They don't use connections. What they use instead is it depends on, which makes sense. So here you can just specify, for example, what I did here, the Azure function, or actually the custom one activity depends on the Azure function. And this way they can visualize the dependencies, the connections. It's very convenient, but I think it's also potentially limiting because what Elsa 3 will allow us to do is to use different kinds of flowcharts or different kinds of diagrams, I should say. For example, we could now have not just flowchart style activities, but it could also be sequential activities where it's not a flowchart, but just a series of steps. Could be a state machine or even a BPMN custom activity or anything else we come up with. So I think it's more flexible and it's not limiting, right? Because you can always add a container as your activity property.
I think everything should be possible. It depends on actually. Because if you look at any of the charts, it's always A to B and a connection between those. And if you always look at that from the endpoint or where it goes to and it says depends on, you can basically create everything relating it back.
That's exactly the case. But I was pointing out that they are doing something else that's interesting, and that is it's, for example, the true property here. Let me pull up this guy here. So they call it the if true activities, which is a property of the if condition type. It's an array, and that's another difference. Yeah. And it's very convenient. But I think having this as an array is also potentially limiting. Maybe not, I'm not sure, but it's interesting to see how they are doing it. And it's also in contrast to what Windows Workflow Foundation does. So maybe it's a learning that they did. Maybe they realized, let's keep it simple, and it's good enough for this pipeline editor.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that two activities, and for me, it's in static that there are two activities being executed in that true. What I would found interesting is that it would have, for instance, two starting activities. That would be more interesting to know than the amount of the whole activity flow in there. And that's one of the questions that I had in Elsa 3. If you don't have any depends on, basically as it is used here, is it always a starting activity then? If nothing else connects to that, it's considered a starting?
That's right. Yeah, so if we look at here, let's say there's no connection. So now we have two starting ones, and you don't know upfront which one is going to be used unless you look in the data structure, because the engine will now pick the first one it finds.
Only the first one, or execute them both?
Good question. I think it will take the first one, but that's just an arbitrary choice, really. It could just as well have been, well, let's execute all starting activities. Maybe that makes sense.
But I like that concept in the Elsa 2 flows where you have multiple starts that you can use, and I use that regularly, that you can say, well, I want to start on a signal, but also on a cron job, for instance.
Yeah, so that's still the case in Elsa 3. So for that you need to use triggers. So let's say we have two triggers, or maybe use the same one. Let's say we have event 1 and event 2. And you can both mark them as startable. This is important, by the way.
Oh.
Yeah, so now you can execute this workflow by either firing this one or this event, but you do need to mark them as startable because that's how the engine indexes the workflow by looking at, what triggers to create based on these settings. So you have a bit more control. The downside is you actually need to be aware of this. So it can be confusing, but this would just work and you didn't mark it as startable and it won't work. It could be confusing. The reason I did it is because imagine you have this workflow here. Let me show you.
Could we live without that startable? Because if there's no input on it or a prior one, then assume it is a startable because it doesn't make sense to have it like that and not startable if there isn't a prior activity.
Exactly. If you look at this workflow and let's forget about these for a second. If you look at this, then you would be right in thinking, well, it's only these two, so and these are triggers. So what's the problem, right? Why not just take them? The thing is that these two activities are part of a collection of the outer flowchart. So the root activity of the workflow. So workflow is a model that looks like this. So this is a class, or actually this is a class, and it has a root. So this is the start activity basically. And all workflows have a single activity with which it starts. So the workflow itself is also an activity of type composite, which has a root. So it inherits from this thing here. And the root of this workflow is a flowchart activity, which is a separate, it's just another kind of activity. So of course, we could easily program it in such a way where we recognize that, okay, this workflow starts with a flowchart. Let's look at its starting activities and index those. Would work, but it also seems maybe a little bit arbitrary to do it just for this specific type because we also have sequences. So we would have to do the same for a sequence. Look at its first activity, see if it's a trigger and then index it. We may very well do this, but in order to not have to do that, I'm experimenting with the startable activity. And the downside is what I just mentioned, but the advantage I think is it's more explicit. So maybe you do want two triggers, but maybe you want to be able to disable one of them, and this makes it an explicit action. Anyway, that's the thinking we may reconsider. I don't know what's the best way to deal with this. And it seems to me it's also a bit subjective, what's better and what's not so good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I will give it a thought because I like the concept of not having to force users to use something. Using Startable as an enabler disabler feels also a bit like misusing the possibilities, rather having than an activity to be disabled in the workflow to explicitly name it like that. But yeah, we'll give it a thought about the pros and cons and how it is for the user to do that.
Yeah, please do. That would be great. A big disadvantage, I think personally, is you also have to do this when you actually code a workflow. So, for example, not this one, but no. Well, let me just invent some examples. So here, for example, we have simple for each workflow. It has a set of items, and then the root of this workflow is a sequence. So the sequence has an activities property. So this is the contents of this sequence activity. Now let's say we want to have a trigger, let's say an HTTP endpoint to turn this workflow into an API endpoint, for example. With the way the engine currently works, you actually need to say that this can start the workflow. So it's not very intuitive or convenient because you would think that maybe this should just work. But now it only works if you do this, and if you forget about this, you have some time that you're going to spend to figure out why it's not working. So it's another disadvantage.
But was it working then with the right line?
Oh yeah, so this example explicitly invokes this workflow. So here I have code. Let's see, this is the 48. That's this one. So this is workflow 11. So here I'm just saying run workflow 11 or whatever I configure here. So this will always work because the way this works is just execute the workflow, and the workflow itself has a root activity. So the root activity will be scheduled for execution, and that's a sequence, and the sequence will then schedule its child activities for execution. That will always work. But the thing is with triggers, right? Like HTTP endpoint, signal receive, event, that kind of thing. For that, the engine or the system needs to index its workflow definition and extract or interpret the triggers and request some bookmarking information that gets stored in the database in the triggers table. So this would get populated. So that's the deal.
Yeah, then that makes more sense. Sorry.
Yeah. Why don't we have it then true as default that it can start the workflow because it's a trigger?
Sorry, I'm not sure I get the question. Can you repeat?
For example, the HTTP endpoint, can't we have the can start workflow as true by default? And then if I want to disable it, I will disable it.
Yeah, that's another option. Maybe it's a good one. And this would then mean for all triggers by default they are enabled. And if you don't want that, you have to explicitly disable. But it might make sense because in most cases you want it to be startable. The tricky part, of course, is if you use a trigger as a blocking activity, which means it's not a starting activity, but it's somewhere on the somewhere here. Let's say I want to move this in between. So now it's no longer, well, it will actually be able to start a workflow because even though it's not a starting activity anymore, it's marked as startable. So if I now trigger event 1, this workflow will actually start with this activity and go into the write line, and this will be ignored. So that's the other side of it. If you do what you suggest, Mohammed, everything will be startable or can start. Startable will be true, and that's has a different issue because this is not expected, I think. So here you would have to uncheck, and you would have to do it for every blocking activity that you do not want to start a workflow with. You have to explicitly make it unstartable, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's a tricky problem, I think. But maybe we should just accept that there is common logic and common use cases where a workflow starts typically with a container, and we can just look at the first item of sequence activities and the first or the starting nodes of a flowchart activity. In most use cases that works. And for those workflows that don't start with a container, but just, let's say, a write line, because that's possible as well. This could be replaced with another write line, but let's say an HTTP endpoint would be quite useless because now it will trigger the workflow, but nothing will happen because HTTP endpoint cannot itself contain more activities. But in this case, it will be found as by the indexer as a trigger. So yeah, let's give that some thought, see if we can come up with a more elegant approach. Oh, by the way, one other thing I had a couple of, or not more than a couple of changes ago, I think a couple of months ago, was to allow the workflow itself to have a set of triggers. I think I removed it. Yeah. So there was a way to, this is not a good example, by the way. Let me go into this one. Yeah, here we have a workflow builder, and this workflow builder would allow you to specify the triggers. So a trigger would be a separate notion. It would just be, it would be analogous to Azure Functions, where you create a function and you can associate it with triggers. So the trigger itself would not be an activity per se. It could be an activity, but it could also just be a mechanism to associate with your workflow so that when that trigger is invoked, it will invoke the associated workflow. That's another way it could be done. So imagine we would say with trigger, and this could be timer, let's say. So now it would be stored on the workflow level itself and not on the activity structure. And this, of course, works well. I liked it because it's very explicit to associate your workflow with triggers, but it's then also inconsistent with the UI because how would you translate that notion into the UI? One approach that I tried was adding triggers to the top. So you can add one or zero or more triggers. One could be a timer, another could be HTTP endpoint. But then there's use cases where you actually want to perform certain logic depending on the type of trigger that was invoked. For example, let's say we have these two triggers, and when the HTTP endpoint is received, maybe I want to maybe set a variable read from the query string that was passed from this trigger. So that's different logic than when compared to the event 2, when maybe it receives some payload, requires a different bit of interpretation to get its input into some variable. So you want to maybe normalize the various types of input into a normalized variable and then continue. And that implementing that logic would not make sense when you just specify these triggers. So there's all sorts of considerations to keep in mind.
Yeah, I agree. The logic, depending on the trigger, is needed. I use that now. You could think about the triggers that you put on the workflow instance as elements on the grid, on the canvas. Then it makes it a bit unlogical for how did they end up there. And I think this is more consistent and more intuitive if you do it like this.
Yeah, exactly. So so for now it's an explicit action to mark something as startable if you want to do it. But let's see if we can find a way where it's not necessary to mark something as startable. but maybe have some rules that identify this based on common patterns. That should be extensible. So let's say you also have a new kind of container activity, then you should be able to have maybe some, I don't know, some trigger provider implementation, let's say, that implements a strategy to return some information about some trigger. That would, from the user's point of view, would be even better because then they don't need to think about Startable. Then this would just work because from a user's point of view, it's intuitive. It doesn't require them to do anything special. So it's worthwhile considering this, I think.
Maybe a question a bit off topic, but I was explaining Elsa 2 workflow and workflows by code to a colleague today. I was a bit struggling with the then and when and nested sequences in that. And I was wondering, is there ever considered to see that the designer, you can draw them and you can generate, for instance, C# code out of that, how it would be coded?
Yeah, so this question has been asked on GitHub at least once, I believe. But yeah, that question did come up, and I think it would be great to have a designer who can spit out C# code that then allows you to have a workflow in C#, but created using the designer. It's absolutely not out of the question.
Okay. I think it will reduce the learning curve for the coding part dramatically, and the adaptation then of workflows is a bit higher, I guess.
Yeah, and especially if you are talking about the API for Elsa 2, it gets quite complicated and hard to work with, especially with the flowchart model, where the Fluent API attempts to connect activities as you create them to others, to the next one. But with Elsa 3, I don't know if you've taken a look at the Elsa 3 structure, but I think
I did, and way more clear, and it's more intuitive how to read it, and also the indentations with it makes it way easier to read.
I think so too, yeah, because of course it's nested, right? So as you say, there's indentation, there's no manual connecting between activities. It's just you just declare what you want to happen here, and then a sequence is a sequence of steps, and then an if has, well, this if has two properties here. So it should already be a little bit better, but I agree, even code, it is hard to read, so having designer support to create that code, that would be helpful. And especially interesting with code generators. We can have workflows stored as a JSON file, and all you would have to do as a user is store the JSON file somewhere, and then the code generator would generate for you.
Fun project to do.
I was hoping you would say that, so I'm actually kind of looking forward to some cool demo maybe in the near future.
Oh, even in the near future. Okay, challenge accepted.
Awesome, that's great. And since we're on the topic of easily declaring workflows, let me just remind you, there's, where do I have it here? There's a DSL module, which is a different take on easily creating long-running workflows, or any workflow for that matter. And here's a nice example. I think this one, yeah, this one is nice. So of course there's no syntax coloring yet, and this is irrelevant. This is out of date. This is out of date too. Well, but here, this is, I think it's very readable, right? It's just from top to bottom. This is actually not a C# if statement, but the if activity, where you configure the then outcome and the else outcome, and each statement is actually an activity. And this is like an alias to the write line activity, and you can configure the alias you want to use. Of course, you don't have to use aliases. You can also just say write line like this and say text equals whatever, like that. I still think nope. Not too many people like it. Actually, nobody likes it that I've spoken with, except for one. But I still think this is quite awesome. Because think of the ramifications. If you can write a simple script that implements a long-running process, because this doesn't have to execute from start to end. It could also be like wait for customer to approve offer. This could be a high-level activity, and it seems quite powerful to me that you can write scripts this way.
Now you have two that are enthusiastic about DSL.
Yeah, since you're busy with it, I think it might be fun for you too.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, great. And here's another example where you just can say delay, and this will actually delay and suspend the workflow or await some signal. And most of this code actually works. The delay, I think, works. This one doesn't, but yeah, this works. All right, enough about the DSL. Any other questions from anyone?
Yeah, I had one question. In Elsa 3 Designer, I know that you can connect the output of one activity to multiple activities.
Oh yeah, you mentioned this.
Yeah, in that case, the execution is not very clear to me.
Right. So you're saying, let's say we have a right line. Okay. Yeah. The way it should work is it goes from right line to this one, then to this one, and then to this one, and then this one, right?
Yeah.
This
Then
is
I joined them all into one activity, and that one got executed twice.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So like this. Then let's add another one like this, and this is going to execute twice. So line one, three A, the end. Yeah. So it goes from this to this, then to this one, then to this one. But everything is scheduled at the same time. So the flowchart activity schedules all connections. So this is the first connection, and it schedules this one as well. And then it's going to execute. And because this one finished, it's going to look for its connection, which is this one. When this one finishes, it's executing this one, so that makes sense. And then it gets to this one because it's a stack-based scheduling system. And then that's what we see exactly here. Then we get 2A, and again the end. And you're saying maybe you don't expect that. If you look at this from a user's point of view, maybe you would expect something else to happen. So maybe you can talk us through the way it should execute.
The way it looks to me, it's like a fork and join scenario.
Mm-hmm.
So I would expect that it will execute both branches in parallel.
Mm-hmm. So this one and this one, then this one and this one. Okay.
And then it is joining to the last activity. So I would expect it will execute only once.
So then this would execute and this would execute, and then somehow the engines should know that, well, I just want this one, even though it's... Yeah, so with the Elsa 2, we have a fork activity that does basically what this thing is doing here. And then we use a join, and the join activity has the logic to, well, it receives both inbound executions, but it blocks further execution depending on the setting. So it's either going to wait for all inbound branches to complete or any one of them before it continues. Yeah. It would be interesting to have this notion implemented without needing an explicit join maybe, but I'm struggling a little bit to figure or to come up with a way that makes sense. Maybe somebody else has any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you can detect it. It was an interesting exercise though. When you first showed it, I was, yeah, this is the expected behavior. But I can also go with the fact that it is an implicit fork and join.
Yeah, exactly.
Having that, knowing the Elsa 2 implementation, especially for the join, where you can say wait all or wait any, that is not possible with that. And you have to have at least some properties on the join part to be able to set that, to be able to say, well, wait any or wait all.
Yeah, if you want that behavior or that feature, indeed, you need to have a way to configure that. And it cannot be a setting on this flowchart that contains this diagram itself, because you could have many more branches where sometimes you want to wait all and sometimes you want to wait any, right? Like here. So here we have another fork and then another merge or join. So maybe here we want to wait for the first one to complete, and here we want to wait for both of them because maybe there's two triggers to wait for, or some two tasks. These would be two tasks that execute in the background. You want to wait for both of them, and here we have two triggers, a timeout and an event or user action, and then you want to wait for one of them. And there's, as you say, there's no way to configure that without an explicit activity like join, unless...
We could do it as if there are multiple inputs on an activity, that you get additional properties on that activity. For instance, like this, where you could say, oh, there are two inputs now. What do you want? You want to execute all?
Yeah. Yeah.
You want to wait any, or and so on?
Yeah, precies. So maybe these would even be these settings would not physically be stored on the activity itself, unless it's some metadata that's like dependency properties that we have with XAML, where you have dependency properties. So that will be a property exposed by the flowchart, because only those settings are only relevant to the flowchart model or activity. Or maybe these settings will be stored on the connection, because this connection could receive properties. We could make it selectable, and then you can configure stuff on the connection.
Yeah, but it doesn't make sense to put it on the connection, because that connection doesn't have any knowledge about the other connection that by accident goes to the same activity.
Yeah, exactly. This will be identified by the flowchart activity itself, which knows about all connections, and it knows about this node having two inbound connections, so it could inspect these things. But I think think your intuition is right that it should be on this activity here because you don't want to configure it on this one and this one because it applies to both inbound. You want to control at this level whether to block, wait for all or wait for any. But that will be pretty cool to pull off because then we don't need to use an explicit join and a fork.
Then when it comes to looping again,
What's that?
If you are looping, if you have a loop, then
like this. Here.
That shouldn't be a problem now.
Yeah, it should work fine, right? Because this one has two inbound connections. If you configure this one to, you say, wait any or wait all, doesn't matter. So if it's, let's say, wait any, if this one comes in, it goes into this one, and then straight to this one. Yeah, and that's the nice thing about a flat flowchart model, where you don't have artificial nested activities like we have in Elsa 2 with iterate outcome and then or true and false outcomes of the if activity. With model what we have here explicitly. So here they are explicitly nested, lower level parts of the hierarchy. With this flat model, we don't have that issue. So it's okay to just make arbitrary connections as you should be able to do in a flowchart. I like that idea. Let me make a note of this. All right, awesome. Anything else, guys? If not, then thank you all for joining, and we'll see you next week.
Okay, I'll save my questions for the next time.
Great, thanks.
Bye bye, thank you.